Bill Shorten has spoken for the first time since conceding defeat on election night. He's blamed the media, corporate Australia and Clive Palmer for the outcome. Here's Bill.
Rather than commentators' snap judgments or hindsight masquerading as insight, it is important that we take our time to reflect. But obviously we were up against corporate leviathans, a financial behemoth, spending unprecedented hundreds of millions of dollars, advertising, telling lies, spreading fear. They got what they wanted.
Oh, Rita, it's everyone's fault but Bill.
My goodness, they do say there's 5 stages of grief, and I think he's caught in the very first stage, which is denial. There is just no acceptance there that this wasn't the big end of town that defeated him. This was ordinary Australians rejecting the class warfare, the politics of envy, identity politics, the mad climate alarmism. That was what was rejected. It wasn't some grand conspiracy. This is nonsense from Bill, and all it does is further damage the Labor brand.
Campbell, the contrast between him and Anthony Albanese was pretty obvious today because Albo, he wasn't the leader, but he stood up there and said, look, I need to take my share of responsibility, but Bill didn't seem to want to take any.
Well, look, I guess you make a very good point. I mean, I've got actually a soft spot for Anthony Albanese, but he's going to have to, I think, really bring the Labor Party back from the far left where they've been. But just back on Shorten again for a moment. I mean, I'll just add a bit to what Rita said. I mean, look, let's look at who he had on his side. He had GetUp, he had massive amounts of union money, he had the ABC, he had The Guardian, he had Channel 9 Fairfax, he had almost 3/4 of anybody who's on Twitter, on social media. I mean, he had lots of people, you know, sort of working out there supporting him. I mean, frankly, in most elections, the Conservatives don't have that level of support. I think the only difference in terms of dollars this time around was Clive Palmer. And just one final small point. He made the statement, hundreds of millions of dollars, classic Bill Shorten hype. I mean, we're hearing that Palmer spent about 60, maybe to 80 million. I don't think, you know, maybe GetUp spent 12, but let's put this in context. So saying hundreds of millions of dollars was spent against the Labor Party just shows what complete, unmitigated, self-serving BS that was from Shorten today.
People often make their best speeches when they're in defeat or under pressure, Rita. It wasn't his finest moment today. I think back to election night and Tony Abbott, when Tony Abbott got towelled up in Warringah and he went out there and said, look, we've got some good news and we've got some not so good news. You know, I mean, Bill had an opportunity there to really reshape himself going forward, but he just looks like he's licking his wounds.
He is, and if you're in that headspace, perhaps it's best not to take the lectern and talk. Perhaps just stay in the background for a while until you're in a position to be a little bit more rational and you've coped with losing the unlosable election. I think that was just really ungracious. And you're right, Tony Abbott, on that devastating night for him personally, gave one of his best speeches. And I think, you know, almost universally people looked at that and said, good on you, whether we agree with you or not, you went out full of class. And that speech is, you know, what you should aim for when you've had a bad loss. I
mentioned the fact that Albo, even though he wasn't the leader or even the deputy, he took some responsibility today for what happened on election night, but also he told a very funny story, I think worth replaying, a funny little yarn about a text message gone wrong involving Scott Morrison. Here's Albo.
He actually did text me, congratulations, to a wrong number a couple of days ago. And he then on Tuesday followed up with a text message that I thought was from Scott, my mate from Concord, who I grew up with. So, to Scott and Cherie, g'day.
He's got a sense of humour, Albo. He's unveiled his new leadership team today. Deputy Richard Marles. In the Senate, Penny Wong is leader. Christina Keneally is the deputy, but only after the factional warlord Don Farrell stepped aside. So was Don Farrell pushed or did he jump, Campbell?
Well, given that he has a significant position of power, maybe he just looked at the whole optics of what was going on, and maybe he did the right, like he felt he was doing the right thing. I guess we'll know in time. There'll probably be a leak or two insiders talking about it. But you know, it is a pity. This shows what happens when you take this sort of quota thing, and also it's sort of the manifestation of Labor's position and sort of pressure, if you like, on the coalition. When they've got this situation now, they leave great people like Ed Husic out. I mean, you know, that's not what these sorts of policies should be about. You want to take the best people forward because it's the right thing for the Labor Party, but it's also, of course, more importantly, ultimately the best thing for Australians to have the best possible opposition as well. And I really mean that. So the best man or woman for the job should have been there.
Yeah, let's go to Albo to try and work out whether or not he had to push him or whether he jumped.
I don't regard this as a captain's call at all. He was prepared to step aside as Labor's deputy leader in the Senate on the basis that he understood that I'd made it clear that my view was there needed to be gender balance in Labor's leadership team.
So, Rita, it wasn't a captain's call, but somehow Don picked up on the smoke signals that Albo didn't want him.
Oh, very clear smoke signals. He made it clear in his own words. And this is just such patronising rubbish. It really is. We joked about this earlier in the week about, you know, should Labor institute quotas for their leadership team? Is that the only way they're going to get a woman up again as leader? And they seem to have sort of embraced that, because it's all about gender diversity. It's not about who's best equipped to do the job, who's most accomplished, the best performer, who's put in the time and has earned it. It's just about, well, we've got two blokes as leader and deputy leader, so we need to have two women in the Senate to balance that up. I mean, that is not great for the party. It's not great for the women either, because when women get there on merit, that's questioned when you have decisions like this, which are motivated purely by the optics, not by the substance of the people selected.
Now, Campbell, there was a bit of a Twitter war yesterday between you and Albo, where you were telling him to hurry up and make a decision on the Adani coal mine, and Albo slapped you back, saying he wouldn't be taking advice from you. Is everything OK between you and Albo, mate?
Well, let me say this again. I sort of intimated this before. I've got a soft spot for Anthony. I really do. And the reason is that when I was the Lord Mayor of Brisbane, and then as Premier as well, we've sat down on many occasions and had a red wine and a steak, and we've talked about building this nation and building infrastructure in Queensland and in Brisbane. So he supported me on some very important projects up here. So I'll always appreciate that. But, you know, I do have a message for him, and if he wants to come to Queensland again, he's got to completely extricate himself from the tangle that is Labor Party policy. You either support coal, blue-collar workers, Australia's largest, arguably most important export industry, or certainly one of our largest, and get behind 100%, and you stop playing weasel words and equivocating, and you also get behind a major project like Adani. That's all I'm after him to do. And frankly, the way I put it to him was fairly respectful and polite.
Okay.
So he really needs to make a stand and take the message from the election only a couple of weeks ago.
His response wasn't respectful nor polite. It was a pretty cheap shot, and I would have thought now that he's been elevated to leader, he would be above that sort of, you know, childish antics. That's sort of the thing you expect from Twitter trolls, not from the leader of the opposition. And you know what? It was not only a cheap shot, he's just elevated Christina Keneally, who had a far worse loss as Premier of New South Wales than Campbell. So, you know, it didn't even stand up to any sort of scrutiny, and I don't think it painted Albo in a great light.